That was worship. Collect my many pages of notes here. If you can't hear me at any point, it's probably because of my children. So they might have something better to say. So, this morning we're going to talk a little bit about something in the Gospels. I like sharing out of Jesus' words and his teachings. It's one of my favorite places. The Gospels are so easy to read and they're easy to understand most of the time, and they're very interesting because Jesus was a very interesting person that did very unique things. At least the people that or the towns he went to and the people he met, a lot of them thought he was way off his rocker. So he's a very interesting person to read about. So this morning, for a few minutes, we're going to talk a bit about a subject that I should have done weeks and weeks of study on, but I didn't, because it's a very it's a subject that you could spend a lot of time studying and a lot of time studying together, because it kind of connects from Genesis 1 right to the end of the Bible. It's a theme. I spent 2 weeks thinking and studying about it, but I'm kind of excited about it. I'm going to talk a bit about Sabbath rest this morning and what it means, and we're going to look a bit at Old Testament Sabbath and what we all know in the Old Testament, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. If you read those books, they had a lot of the Torah and a lot of the law was very strict, and a lot of it was based around the Sabbath. There was a lot going on. Mostly things they could not do. And then we're going to go to Jesus and what he said about the Sabbath and how it applies to us today. And also, in studying Sabbath, it takes us to something that is yet to happen in our Christian life. So, there's a little, I was going to get you to do a little exercise. I'm kind of scared to get you to do it because I wouldn't want to do it, but I think I'm going to get you to do it. So what I want you to do to start, just for a few minutes, is just turn to the person beside you. And if there's nobody beside you, you can just talk to yourself or think about it. Or if you don't want to talk to the person beside you, that's okay too. Turn to them and just in a minute or less, tell each other one thing you really like or value about Sunday, or your day of rest that you have set aside, which appears to be Sunday because you're here. And also, if you have time and you think of something, tell them one thing you think, this could get complicated, but tell them one thing, if you want, you think a day of rest is for as a Christian. Why do you think we have a day of rest? So the first thing, just tell them one thing you value about Sunday as you do it. And then if you get to it, tell them one thing, or tell them what you think, why you think we have a day of rest as Christians. So go ahead. Tell them what you like. Tell the person beside you what you like about Sunday. And you don't have to whisper. That's fine. Hey, thank you. You're very studious students. Didn't even have to tell you to stop talking. Good. Thanks for taking part in that. That's all you have to do. Now you can just warm the bench and listen if you care to. I noticed through the whole service this morning, there's a lot of things that kind of tie together, and I feel like the preacher always gets up and says this, but is true again. In Sunday school, Al mentioned a passage I'm going to look at, and I thought of it in the devotions with 6 days around Jericho. The seventh day was it was interesting that God picked 7 days, I thought, and there were some other things. So Sabbath was thinking back to the Old Testament, it was a day of rest considered holy to God, which he established when he created the world. You read Genesis and you see that. And it was also viewed as a sign, this I found interesting, as a sign of the covenant relation between God and his people. And the eternal rest he has promised his people. So we often read in Genesis and say, and God rested on the seventh day and said we should do that, and it's easy to stop there. But it's kind of neat to see what he had in mind for his people back in the Old Testament. And I think to them it was really important that I think partly why they took Sabbath so seriously was because God commanded them to, but also it was a sign of the covenant between them and God. So it was a day specifically set aside every single week where they would think about that, the covenant relationship. So the word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means to cease. That's simply what it means. Ceasing all work. The Hebrew Sabbath was celebrated every 7 days and became basic to recognizing and worship of God, his creation, and redemption. When you read Mosaic law, it's full of regulations concerning the Sabbath. And there's some weird ones, or some interesting ones, I should say. 6 days to do their work and rest on the seventh, which was what day of the week? Saturday. The main reason being that God rested on the seventh day, which I already said, and that made the day holy. The other reason was a reminder of the redemption from slavery in Egypt, the Exodus. That was also another reason they had Sabbath set aside. So in the Mosaic law, the Sabbath there's a couple of things. Time, it was sacred assembly and worship. They were very, serious about their synagogues and their collective worship. It was a token of their covenant with God, which is in Exodus 31, verse 12. And it was so serious that there was a death penalty for desecration, which is in Exodus 35. And also, the part I really like is in Isaiah 56. We won't take the time to read it, but you can write it down if you want. Isaiah 56, 1-7 talks about when they truly observed the Sabbath, like it was meant to be observed, it would bring spiritual nourishment. And also, that passage is talking about salvation of foreigners, which is really interesting. So the Sabbath became the heart of the law. More and more things being prohibited, and I think that's partly why you have the clash between the Pharisees and Jesus when he came. So they kept prohibiting more and more things, it became such a thing. Even tying and untying a knot became illegal activity on the Sabbath. That was too much work, which caused all of this caused the true spirit and purpose of the Sabbath to become lost to satisfy the legal requirements of the day. And that's kind of the scene that Jesus came on. So how did Jesus respond to the Sabbath? Did he keep it? Did he become a controversial figure in relation to the Sabbath? One thing Jesus was really good, it seems, was causing strife between himself and the religious leaders, the Pharisees. he unsettled them. And it's kind of interesting, which makes sense. He had a lot of radical ideas that if they would have actually allowed themselves to believe the prophecies that they taught themselves, they would have seen that he was the Messiah, because he fulfilled those prophecies. But in Luke 4, I'll quick read Luke 4, verse 16. It shows us what he did on the Sabbath. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, and when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. And then he read in Isaiah. Then he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes were fixed on him. And then he said the thing of, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And that made people's mouths fall open. So Jesus took Sabbath seriously. He says he was brought up in Nazareth, so he probably grew up going to that synagogue. And I was wondering, when I was looking at it, I was like, I wonder what qualified them to stand up and speak. Was it, he was a rabbi? Maybe that's why. Maybe someone else knows, but I didn't take time to study into that. The Gospels often record him reading the Torah. When he would stand up in a synagogue, he would read from the Torah. And what else did he do in the synagogues that they didn't like? Healed. He healed people. And he said things the leaders disagreed with. So what do you think Jesus wanted to teach us about worship on the Sabbath? So now we're going to turn, you can turn if you want to Mark 2. So obviously in Luke, when he got up and read at synagogue, his goal, even though a lot of the leaders disagreed with him, didn't like what he was doing on the Sabbath, it's obvious his goal wasn't to just get rid of it or just not do it like they were. So what did Jesus say about the Sabbath? In Mark 2, we'll read there. So Mark is an interesting book. This is kind of a side note, but it's written by John Mark. They think it was written by John Mark of things that Peter passed on to him to write. It wasn't written by Peter, but a lot of it was Peter's thoughts and things he had remembered and recorded. And the theme of Mark is to present and defend Jesus' universal call to discipleship, which I thought was really interesting. So, and he often narrates the teachings of Jesus in a way that implies that discipleship is a relationship with Jesus, not just a code of conduct. And fellowship with Jesus is the core of a disciple's life. So it's really interesting. And in Mark, there's a lot of stories about Peter and his blunderings. And Mark makes Peter look a lot less glamorous and more human. And I think that's because it was Peter's thoughts. Or it was Peter telling the story. So he probably beat himself up a bit more than the other disciples. So in Mark 2, we're not going to read the whole chapter, but at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus forgives and heals a paralytic man. And they weren't okay with that because that's the one they let down through the roof. And then he went and met Matthew the tax collector. And then verse 18, he's questioned about fasting. He was questioned, why aren't you disciples? So the disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. And they were confused why his disciples were not fasting. And he said, why do they need to fast if I am with them? And then we get to verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? But he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. And then in chapter 3, he went and healed somebody on the Sabbath right after that. And then he withdrew, and a great multitude followed him. And he healed a bunch of them. Very interesting stories. So there's a couple of verses in there that we're going to take some thoughts from. Notice, but first of all, I want you to notice the times, I think it's just once, but notice the times Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. This is Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. It shows his human and divine traits. It gives Jesus authority to forgive sins and heal. But it also signifies his humanity. And I think it's Jesus often refers to himself as Son of Man. And I think it's he's trying to get us to see truly who he is. I think it's a stepping stone on our way to understand how Jesus came and fulfilled the Sabbath and is Lord of the Sabbath, like it says in verse 28. So an interesting thing is that Christians first met with the Jews in the synagogue to worship and proclaim Christ in Acts 13. It's just one verse, so I'll quickly read it. Acts 13, verse 14. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch of Pisidia and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. And it's a story of Paul. So the Christians worshipped with the Jews in the synagogues. So here Paul is preaching in a synagogue and preaches the gospel. Really interesting he uses biblical theology and preaches it to them. He connects the story of the Israelites to Jesus coming and being the true king, which was a very controversial thing to say. But people loved it, and until the crowds got so big that they got jealous and chased him away. And I'm not going to go into the study of when and how it switched from Sabbath to the first day of the week, which is Sunday, for the day of worship for Christians. But think of the most amazing part of Jesus and his gospel and proof that he saves us. What part is that? Resurrection. The resurrection. The resurrection is what is so amazing about Jesus and his gospel, and is what makes him stand out so much from other people that wanted to be followed. So he rose on the first day of the week, and I think that's why which became a holy day for Christians. So Jesus came and fulfilled the Sabbath. He is the Son of Man who is Lord of the Sabbath, like it says in verse 28. And only in Jesus can we truly find rest that gives us life. That's the only way we're going to find Sabbath rest. And so he didn't come and say, what you're doing on the Sabbath is totally wrong. This is how you should do it. He fulfilled that. He fulfilled what it meant to rest. So me going home and sitting on the couch after being served a big hot meal, plus I don't have to help with the dishes, that's not true rest. Or that's not true Sabbath rest. It is rest, but that's not what Sabbath rest is. Or it's not taking... I should be careful how I say this, because it is restful, and I don't want to make it sound like the only true rest is spiritual rest. But Sabbath rest isn't just taking a big nap on a Sunday afternoon and because you worked too hard all week. We can experience Sabbath rest when we truly allow the Son of Man to be Lord of our life, Lord of our desires, Lord of our hearts, and Lord of our day of rest, which is Sunday. Until we do that, it's not going to be true rest like Jesus talks about here. So in Colossians 2, the early Christians viewed the Sabbath and matters of the law as a shadow of what Christ came to do. So I'm just going to quickly read, if I can find Colossians. They're so short. In Colossians 2, it's talking about the early Christians and how they viewed the Sabbath. And it's kind of interesting to put it in context. They were dealing with this false teacher that had come in and was leading them astray, and so that's kind of where this context is coming from. So don't let some of the verses really confuse you, because we're not taking it into context about what was going on here. But it says, "So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths," which is what that person had been doing, "which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Let no one cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom all the body, nourished and knit together by joints and ligaments, grows with the increase that is from God. Therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to regulations?" And verse 21, we have some of those regulations that this person had given them. "Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh." So they're trying to take the focus off of all these certain things they were doing and putting it back into Christ being the substance of their day of rest. And in Hebrews 4, 1-11, talks about the Sabbath becoming a symbol of the heavenly rest to come. The rest in Jesus is happening already. When we love and serve him, we experience some of that rest. Like Sunday morning worship. It's an amazing way to experience some of that rest. And if you do Sunday morning, you go to church and you experience that true rest, like we're experiencing this morning, that is what is part of what it means to rest in Jesus, true Sabbath rest. There is a sense of waiting, though, for the consummation of the rest it is talking about in Hebrews 4. So we experience some of that rest in Jesus, but we're still waiting for the full rest. When Jesus comes for his church, the full experience of that rest will take place. And until then, we get to experience little pockets of rest, but not just on Sunday. So what is Sabbath to you? How does it look? Is it strictly saved for Sunday? How does it affect my daily life if it is more than Sunday? A question I thought of that I need to ask myself is, do I even want to rest? Do I want a life of busy rushing, accomplishing great things, filling it up with people and drama and problems that come with, making lots of money to keep up my good, comfortable Canadian lifestyle? Do I even want the rest that Jesus offers? How often do I stop and simply rest in the truth that I am a disciple of Jesus and just fellowship with him? talk to him in the moment, or simply worship him on a Tuesday morning at 9:30. In creation, in nature, in watching a baby, in prayer, in scripture, in simple daily life, I can find rest in Jesus. It's an everyday thing. It's just really good on Sunday morning. Thinking back to the Sabbath in the Old Testament, God obviously knows what humans need, what we as humans need. To him, a day of rest was so important, and it's obvious that he wants that day of rest to be directed back to him, to worship him. We benefit a lot from setting a day aside for rest and for God. That's just a fact. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus gives us true rest, and he is the reason why we're here this morning. He should be the reason why I'm here this morning. Not because this is just how I grew up, and this is what I do because it's what 10 generations did before me, which if that's the case, that's amazing. But Jesus is here, and he is the reason we gather, and he is the reason we do the things we do during the week. How can I change my current method of resting to be closer to what Jesus intended? How can I rest in a way that brings me closer in fellowship to Jesus? If I believe that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, being a disciple of him means I can have Sabbath rest in Jesus every single day of the week. It means if Jesus is Lord of my life and Lord of the Sabbath, it means I am a 7 days a week Christian, an active disciple of Jesus. Not just a Sunday for 3 hours. And that's what's so amazing about serving Jesus is so we can have a day of rest set aside. We can stop work for half a day and think about how good it is. But if we don't truly allow Jesus to be Lord of our life, we don't have our heart where he wants it, like we studied in Sunday school, then he isn't going to be Lord of our Sabbath and Lord of our life. It affects our everyday occurrence. In closing, I'm going to read Colossians 1, verse 15. Talking about Christ and why we worship him. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. And you, who once were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled in the body of his flesh through death to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Amen. God bless you.